Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. CNN has produced a massive 24-hour documentary television account of the history of the Cold War. It has been praised, it has been criticized. No surprise, the battles over the causes and meaning of that epic period are far from over. And for good reason. Own the past, shape the future. Joining Think Tank to sort through the conflict and consensus are Ronald Radosh of George Washington University's Center for Communitarian Policy Studies and the co-author of the Rosenberg File, Telling the Truth About the Cold War, and Lloyd Gardner, professor of history at Rutgers University and author of Pay Any Price, Lyndon Johnson and the Wars for Vietnam, and Bruce Cumings, professor of history at the University of Chicago and author of War and Television, Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. The topic before the House, the Cold War, what we know. This week on Think Tank. The history of the Cold War is being written and rewritten. Does the CNN series get it right? Some critics have complained that the CNN programs suffer from moral equivalence. That is, it depicts the United States and the Soviet Union as moral equals, both of them guilty of paranoia and both guilty of actions that were both excessive and wrongful. Others say the series is flawed because it depicts Cold War history as an open and shut, settled case. Good guys battling bad guys, good guys win. They complain it leaves very little of the history open to a different interpretation. What will the judgment of history be about the Cold War? The answers to these and other questions will impact how the future unfolds. Own the past, shape the future. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Professor Cumings, thank you for flying in from Chicago while ill. We appreciate you being here. Let's go around the room quickly and get a take on the CNN film to begin. Several of you have argued this in print in the New York Times. Ron, why don't you just give it to us quickly and then we'll start.
It's an ambitious project. The best part about it was their spectacular, riveting footage that helped people, especially people who didn't live through it, capture some of the emotion and power of the era. They have done tremendous film archival work, and they have to have credit for that. I tend to agree with those who feel the great flaw in the series was, as you put it, moral equivalence between the United States and the Soviet Union. Now, the problem with the series is that different people wrote different episodes. Some of the episodes are wonderful. If you look at them all, take all 24 hours together, you don't get a sense that they make a point of moral equivalence. There's very clearly delineated a basic difference between the system of totalitarianism established in Stalin's era and continuing in Eastern Europe, the so-called people's democracies, and the general culture and civil society of the West. But certain episodes do depart from that and make some egregious errors.
Lloyd?
Well, I think it is, as Ron says, a very ambitious effort. But even if you take 24 hours with a subject like the Cold War, you're not going to be able to cover all the subjects. And from my point of view, some of the problems with it have to do with the balance of the coverage. There's not nearly enough, it seems to me, on Asia, not nearly enough on the Third World in general. There are some episodes.
Is there a tilt toward moral equivalence?
I'm sorry?
Is there a tilt in the CNN series toward moral equivalence?
In terms of great
moral equivalence was this great buzz phrase that the conservatives damned the liberals with, saying that's what they thought about the Soviet Union and the United States during these years of the Cold War.
Both conservatives and liberals can have a lot to complain about in this series. For example, the overall narrative is given to the scriptwriters. Historians never appear in this series to discuss these things, so that a statement can go unchallenged by either a leader of the East or a leader of the West.
Bruce?
Well, I don't really think I accept the idea of moral equivalence as being a problem of the documentary or really a problem for our studies of the Cold War in this country. It's very hard for me to think of a single historian who would think that Joseph Stalin and Franklin Roosevelt are moral equivalents. The idea that the Cold War consisted of choosing between Roosevelt and
there are historians who would tend to conflate Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev.
There might be, but I think Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev came very late in the Cold War, and the basic Cold War narrative was never one of moral equivalence. In my view, it was one in which the United States was holding itself to standards that the United States had established. For example, in the persecution of people during the McCarthy period, it isn't a question of, was it worse here than in the Soviet Union? Clearly it wasn't. But did that period uphold the ideals and the First Amendment freedoms that Americans pride themselves on? And I think it didn't. And it's that sense, I think, that the Cold War pulled the United States into actions. Persecuting its own citizens is just one example, but many others in activities abroad that really took the United States outside of its own framework of morality.
You've got
and
Ron
idealism.
Radosh stirring
Let
in
me
his chair,
challenge
and
that
please feel free to talk
very
amongst
sharply,
them.
because I think the worst episode in the entire CNN series was number 6, Reds, about the domestic United States during the so-called McCarthy period. It did exactly what you just said it did not do, which is claim that there was equal repression, suppression of dissenters and dissidents on both sides. Now, in fact, it did not tell you that Alger Hiss, as all the most recent information found in the Moscow archives and the KGB files that historian Alan Weinstein has found, show that Alger Hiss was, in fact, a Soviet spy. What you have is a narration that depicts Alger Hiss as a victim of the menacing Richard Nixon. It does not tell you until the 15th episode that Julius Rosenberg was not arrested and eventually executed because he was a dissenter. He was arrested because he was, as all the most recent evidence proves, without a shadow of a doubt, he was a lifelong Soviet agent. And you have, in fact, had writers, the famous journalist Carl Bernstein refers in his book to the witch hunt period in America as the American Gulag. That is an example of moral equivalence, and I think this CNN series did the same thing.
Now we've got the other side
I think,
energized and activated.
First of all, I think the assumption that they had spies and we didn't have spies seems to be coming out here in Ron's rhetoric, and that is that somehow we weren't guilty of espionage in the Cold War. We weren't trying to do essentially the same things.
That's not. Of course, we had spies. That's not the point. The point is that a lot of people in the United States made a political cause out of saying Alger Hiss was not a spy, and that the Soviets did not have spies.
And the Rosenbergs were innocent.
I mean, that's a distinction with a difference.
Right, in the sense that, only in the sense that they became public issues in the United States
with public constituencies.
Yes, but because we had a very harsh period of reorientation toward the Cold War between 1945 and 1950. And a great many people who were not his and who were not Rosenberg also got caught up in this kind of false charges and false accusations and so on.
I want to go to two things. One is the Cold War is over symbolically, at least with the fall of the Berlin Wall, 10 years now. What do we know now that we didn't know then? A lot of material has come out from Soviet archives. Some has come out from American memoirs and archives. Just in brief, what do we know now that we didn't know?
I think there are many things that have come out in the last 10 years that change or shade our judgments about the Cold War, but I don't think there's been a single revelation in the last 10 years that wasn't anticipated in things that people had written at the time. This is historical material that is being extracted from archives that aren't fully open to historians. Furthermore, much of the material it falls on both sides of the debate over the origins of the Cold War. Those who thought that Stalin was not interested in world domination, but rather a more limited and shrewd Machiavellian leader confined.
Do you think Stalin was interested in world domination?
No, I don't. But I just wanted to
Do you think
finish
Stalin
that
was
by
I'll
saying
come back.
that
Do you think Stalin was interested in world domination?
I don't think Stalin had world ambitions in that.
I think Stalin was interested in expanding the Soviet Union to be the central power throughout Europe, including Central and Western Europe, if he could, and that it was a dire threat to the national security of the world.
Let's go back to...
I just wanted to finish that
just
one
finish
point,
that and then
which
we'll go to Lloyd,
is that it's clear now that Stalin didn't think the Greek guerrillas in the Greek Civil War, which is so important to the Truman Doctrine in 1947 and 48, he wasn't supporting the guerrillas. That was something that experts on the situation thought to be true, that was validated in the archives. On the other hand, in the case of the Korean War, he gave more help to the North Koreans than people had thought. But it doesn't change the basic character of either the Korean War or the Greek Civil War, in my view.
I want to come back to what we don't know still, and that is, aside from what Bruce says about the selectivity of what we know out of the various archives, we don't have anything like the openness in the American archives. But the point is, we don't have archives from very many key players. We don't have North Korean archives. We don't have South Korean archives in any great extent. We have some from Eastern Europe, but we do not have nearly what we need to create a whole picture out of the Cold War yet. And so I would stress that too when we're talking about it.
I want to stress one other thing, which is I think this is a very good documentary. I don't want to say it's a lousy documentary at all. There are some wonderful episodes in it. But the underlying epistemology of it seems to be that we didn't know really anything before 1989. And now we've had this flood of new people and new documents and new footage. And now we've really solved all sorts of problems in the Cold War.
That
what
is
I think
not
is just another
surprising
phase.
from a journalistic enterprise where everything has got to be hung on new.
Well, I have great
if
respect
you,
for the people who made this
No,
documentary.
I understand, and I have
they
great
do
knowledge
the
of
best
how
of it.
journalism works, and you got to hang it on what's new. That's just the way it works.
The team
I
that
mean,
worked on this, Jeremy Isaacs and others, had done some of the best documentaries ever made, like The World at War, about World War II. It's more a matter of the historians, I think, who advised them, encouraged them to think that they were just dealing in completely 100% new stuff that had never been heard before.
Well, I think that to take Bruce's own area, which is Korea, and here, as he might have guessed, in strenuous disagreement with him, we did not have evidence until the past 5 or 6 years that, in fact, Stalin gave the green light for the invasion of South Korea by North Korea, and that Mao was involved in this as well. This has all come out from recent archives. The masterful book by John Gaddis, called We Now Know, shows that very clearly and uses this evidence in his discussion. And I think this is new. The proof that the invasion of South Korea was done with Stalin's support and backing, to the extent which Stalin even said, if this results in an atomic war, so be it. We have to go ahead. This is very important for the advance
That's
of
not
our
quite
cause.
true, and
That's
it's
not
also
quite
nothing
true,
new. That was the Truman administration's official position. Was
Yes,
that Stalin
but
gave
those
the
on the
green
left,
light.
like you and others, have always said that it isn't true. In fact, years ago, the journalist I.F. Stone, hero of America's left establishment, argued that there was a South Korean invasion of North Korea and that North Korea was the victim. And this was, if you look at Stephen Ambrose's first volume
I.F.
of his
Stone
foreign
never said
policy book,
anything
he even
like that.
quotes I.F. Stone
Just-
about this.
I was involved in a public dialogue with Soviet officials in, I guess, the mid-1980s, where they claimed in front of a full audience that the Berlin Wall was built as a defense against Western aggression. That was, they built the wall to keep the American tanks out of Berlin. I mean, this is the sort of thing they have been saying. I mean, you don't believe that.
Of course not, and
Okay.
I think one of the things that is unfortunate about the series is its Eurocentrism, as Lloyd said.
Yeah.
In a sense, the Cold War is almost a put-up game if you just look at Europe, because almost every regime in Eastern Europe was imposed by the Soviet Union. These were not indigenous revolutions, with the possible exception of Yugoslavia. Well, that was an exception. Whereas elsewhere during the Cold War, in China, in Vietnam, in Korea, in Guatemala, in Cuba, in a variety of other places, you had two sides that were far more difficult to separate in terms of either morality or their popular support. And the Cold War was generally fought in those places. It wasn't really a war that was fought in Central Europe. The wars occurred in Korea and Vietnam and smaller wars around the world. So it's very important to understand that was the real, those were the sides that...
Well, they were fought also in Washington and Moscow. I mean, that's where the war was being fought. These were all ancillary aspects of what was going on in those two capitals.
People made choices in a context where they might be, being led by some guy who had served the Italian fascists on one side, and they have a communist resistor on the other, and choosing between them is a lot more difficult than choosing between Roosevelt and Stalin.
What I want to come back to is Korean War and what we now know and what we didn't know. For example, it's not true that we didn't know that Russia had a very big stake in this. Khrushchev's memoirs a long time ago said this, that he was there at some of the meetings where Stalin discussed this sort of situation. But what the series also doesn't deal with is the fact that the United States was unilaterally writing a peace treaty with Japan. It was establishing atomic bases on Okinawa, that Syngman Rhee himself, in discussions with John Foster Dulles' aide out in 1950, just on the edge of the Korean War, told John Foster Dulles' aide, and he was a newspaper man, Matthews from Arizona, he told him, I'm going to unite Korea by force. So the point is
this
that we've
known...
This
is what Syngman Rhee said.
This
is what Syngman Rhee said?
Mm-hmm. This is what Syngman Rhee said to William Matthews.
Except that North Korea beat him by the punch. Even if he wanted to do that, North Korea decided to unify by force first to create a communist
Korea. That's exactly my point, that there is a situation here in which two local regimes are struggling, and they have involved the superpower.
Let me move on for a moment now. Let us posit for a moment that I'm just fell off the turnip truck, and I just arrived here in Washington, and I hear this story about the Cold War. There were these bad guys who didn't believe in freedom, who took over a bunch of countries and dominated them as an empire for many years. There were the good guys in the United States who believed in democratic values and thought this was particularly coming after a totalitarian surge in the 30s and 40s with the Nazis, felt that this was a threat to the very values by which we live. You buy that?
I think the United States allied itself with countries that had democratic traditions or were in the process of making a transition to democracy, and supported those countries, Italy, West Germany, France. And there the policies that we followed worked very well, and they were welcomed by the people there. In the case of many third world countries, we were constantly at odds with the very people we were supposed to be supporting.
I mean, you don't
South Vietnam, was that a government that defended freedom in your view?
More so than North Vietnam.
How would you know that?
I would
there
know
were trade
that
unions there functioning, there was civil opposition.
On. Trade unions
Ho
in
Chi
South
Minh,
Vietnam,
even before
give me a break.
the Vietnamese War, Ho Chi Minh murdered thousands of Trotskyists.
Hang on. Are you saying that after World War II, the Poles, the Hungarians, and the Czechs, to name three, would not have liked to have had their own government, but preferred to have Stalin in there saying,
Absolutely, they would have preferred their own government.
So they were occupied, in effect.
They were occupied. I mean, I think one of the significant differences between the U.S. and the Soviet Union is the Soviet Union had to keep troops on the ground in one country after another. 360,000 Red Army troops in East Germany when the Berlin Wall collapsed. It's the countries where the U.S. had to keep troops on the ground, like South Korea, where we still have 37,000 troops, that tell you where we've had problems with the local population.
Was this, at root, a struggle of the good guy against the evil empire?
All right, this was...
That's a simple enough question,
right,
isn't it? I mean, you know...
It's
now you're laughing. Wait a minute, hold on.
I'm laughing because if you say, if you pose the question in the context of a country like France or Czechoslovakia, which had a democratic tradition, that's fine. If you pose the question in the light of the Dominican Republic, where one of the most venal dictators in the 20th century held sway with our support for a long time, Trujillo, then the question is, you have no middle class here, you have no possibility.
The alternative is go from an authoritarian dictatorship to a totalitarian
No, I'm saying it depends on what part of the world we're talking about. And the reason the U.S. got into so much trouble in the Cold War was by extending the doctrine of containment to places where it didn't belong. And this is not my idea, it's George Kennan's idea.
Again, you've sort of not answered.
I'm not going to answer the question in the abstract.
Well, no. Well, let me put it quite specific, because it's something that all us guys off the turnip truck can understand. Was the Soviet Union an evil empire? And if it was not an evil empire, was it because it was not evil or because it was not an empire? Is that Can we
I
get an
think
answer
the
to
Soviet
that?
Union was an empire much more like Tsarist Russia than it was an evil empire. In other words, it expanded in its near reaches. It was fundamentally weak. It had to keep tens of thousands of troops in the countries in its near reaches. And when it tried to expand its power abroad, most of the time it failed.
But no comment
Even in
on
China.
It,
I think you're ignoring totally
no comment on its evilness.
Well, I think it's very hard to say that an entire experiment of 70 years was evil. One of the things the CNN documentary does fairly well is to show you people who actually believed in the system. So it's not just to set up good guys versus bad guys. It's a more complex human experience.
Hitler believed in his system and he was evil.
I don't think that the Soviet Union, even if we say it's evil, is on the same plane
come
of
on.
evil.
Oh, that's the crux
I'd
of the
love
situation.
to debate that with you.
No, wait,
Stalin
one
killed
second.
as many people, if not more, than Hitler. To say that the Soviet Union was not evil is patently absurd. Stalin created one of the most evil, monstrous regimes in history, and I'm delighted that in this issue there is no moral equivalence. The last word is given to Václav Havel, who says that this was an inhumane system
It
that
was an
destroyed,
inhumane system.
and that it was an evil system.
We have a man in the middle
Right.
here on the evil argument.
There's no question that Stalinist Russia was an evil system. There's no question that it blighted an entire generation of Russian leaders who tried to escape from, in some ways, the Stalinist heritage and left them unable to
Was the
function.
Soviet Union until its demise
But
an evil
the Soviet
empire?
Union evolved too. I mean, as it evolved, it produced not only a Stalin, but in the end, it finally produced somebody like Gorbachev and Shevardnadze. When Shevardnadze and Gorbachev talked in 1985, Shevardnadze said everything is rotten. I mean, that was the premise that they had to begin with, that everything is rotten, and that they had to begin to change. These were people who had seen the outside world, for the most part. And Margaret Thatcher herself, of course, said, well, this told Ronald Reagan, this is a man that we can deal with. And so, in other words, when we say evil empire, we have to say, when was it evil? What kind of evil was it? And so on. Stalin was a terrible man, terrible, insecure, paranoid, however you want to put it. All of those things.
The reason you couldn't get me to say it was an evil system is that if you declare it to be evil, then 70 years of history and 40 years of interaction with the United States and our allies is meaningless to students. They won't be interested in it. It's much more interesting to figure out why millions of people would have adhered to that system, in some cases voluntarily, why Stalinism at the end of World War II had a tremendous attraction as an industrial strategy of showing how you can take an underdeveloped country and develop it overnight into an industrial power, which Stalin did with extraordinary brutality. Nonetheless, there's no question that there was a wave of extraordinary passion on behalf of the Soviet Union after World War II. If you think it's just purely evil, you're never going to be able to explain how that happened to students, and you're going to miss a view toward the future in which this history of the 20th century can be used to inform us about the 21st century.
Well, by your lights, what should that experience inform us of?
Well, I think among other things that our system of economics, capitalism, had a history in the 1930s in which it fundamentally broke down, yielding a variety of solutions around the world to the problem of a world economy that wouldn't work, one of which was Stalinism, and that it could happen again. And we've had a financial crisis for 2 years now in the world economy. I don't think it's going to happen again, but it could. And in that circumstance of a breakdown of the world economy, people are going to go for extreme solutions.
The question is, what is the appropriate lesson for the United States from the Cold War? It's got to be brief, 1, 2, 3.
I think the appropriate lesson of the Cold War is the United States should stand firmly for democracy, for trying to advance and export democracy where it can throughout the world, and should not give in to would-be totalitarian dictators or regimes who pose a major threat to the national security of the West.
I think the major lesson is that one cannot become involved all over the world because you see a particular threat at a particular time, and then involving all the other countries in the world is, in the end, undoes your consensus and your foreign policy.
I think the lesson of the Cold War is that when the U.S. sticks to its own ideals and acts according to them, it wins. And when it violates those ideals, it gets involved in morasses like the Vietnam War.
Vietnam War. I mean, that's the one we didn't touch, and I have, we'll talk about it after the show. Thank you very much, Lloyd Gardner, Ron Radosh, and Bruce Cumings, and thank you for Think Tank. I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.